Hey everyone, Daniel Topor here and welcome to the Dancing with Doubt podcast, where we go deep into how leaders have overcome adversity to unleash their success and delve into the why. Why are we really here on this big, beautiful earth? On today's episode, I'm sitting down with the illustrious Dr. Darryl Stickel. Despite facing numerous challenges including bullying, visual impairment, and multiple head injuries, Darryl has developed a superpower, an extraordinary ability to build trust. In fact, he has established himself as one of the world's leading experts on trust, with experience working for McKinsey & Company, advising the Canadian military in Afghanistan, and as faculty in universities in Europe and the United States. These days, Darryl runs his own consultancy in Canada, Trust Unlimited, where he regularly engages with audiences across the globe through inspirational speaking and coaching. With so much uncertainty and change in the world, it's easy for us to lose our bearings. But I think you'll find Darryl has some really valuable insights into how we can effectively build trust and positivity in even the most challenging of situations. Really excited to bring this episode to you. Keen to learn a lot myself. I hope you are too. Thanks for lending us your ears wherever in the world you are. Episode 6, let's begin. Darryl, welcome to the Dancing with Doubt podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Daniel. It's just a real pleasure to be here with you and your audience.
Yeah, thanks for making it down, and really been looking forward to it, as I'm sure you are. Darryl, the topic of trust really fascinates me because trust is core to all of our relationships in life, with each other, with our governments, even with technology. Why do people find it difficult to trust, though?
Well, trust is the willingness to be vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. And, I believe that trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. When we're deciding whether to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. The first is, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty. And the second question is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And we multiply those together. So uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. If we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do. And if we look in the world right now, we see that vulnerability certainly hasn't gone down, but uncertainty has really gone up. And that makes it so much harder for us to be vulnerable with one another or to allow ourselves to be vulnerable in different settings. And so I think that's why we're seeing such low trust levels in the world right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think, this conversation's found us at a very, very, very timely era. Like you mentioned, with governments, there's probably record low trust. There's wars going on. There's a pandemic response that was probably not the best it could have been all over the world. And I know you've done some interesting studies on that based on your masterclass. Tell me, how did you get into this topic around trust? How did you find this calling of yours?
So I grew up in a small town in northern Canada, and it was pretty remote, fairly isolated, and conditions were harsh. It was minus 40 degrees on the regular during the winter. And it has the distinction of being one of the few places in the world where it has snowed every month of the year at one point or another. So some year in August, it snowed in Fort St. John. And in that environment, people have to pull together. There are challenges that we face that we can't overcome simply by ourselves. And we need everyone to pull in the same direction or the community will struggle. And so against that backdrop, I learned that if I could be helpful, I should. And I developed a sense of empathy and caring and understanding for others. And I had some challenges when I was growing up. Um, I had a father who was injured early in my life. When I was about 7 years old, he was injured in a car accident, lost his leg, cracked his pelvis, broke his hip, crushed several vertebrae in his back, and he was in pain for the rest of his life. And he struggled and self-medicated with alcohol, and so our relationship was challenging. When I was 17, I was playing hockey and I got attacked by a fan with a club. beaten nearly to death. And I knew at that time that I was going to lose my sight. I had a hereditary retinal disorder, and it was degenerating. My eyesight was getting worse. And my plan had always been to think for a living, right? To train my brain to a place where I would be able to earn a living by thinking. And now all of a sudden I couldn't think. Um, I had a severe head injury, and um, I had the attention span of a fruit fly. And so I went from being on the honor roll and doing really well in school to failing everything. And I had this sense of helplessness and hopelessness and loss, um, that most would go through in an experience like that. And it evoked in me an understanding of what other people were going through. And so when I eventually went to university, I'd find myself sitting on the bus, and somebody would just sit down next to me and say, "I'm really having a hard time." And so for some reason, people would come to me and they would open up to me. And I wanted to understand what that was, what was driving that. And so I started down a path towards becoming a clinical psychologist. And then I realized that, a lot of the people I was working with were really struggling, and they just couldn't move from A to B. And so, I was working with families in crisis, troubled teens, working on crisis lines, those kinds of things. And I was having a hard time with the futility of some of these situations. And so I transitioned and went into public administration. I ended up working in native land claims, and I was doing a master's degree in public admin. And they would ask me these sort of deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like 50 years after claims are settled? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people that we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us? And I thought, wow, that's a good question. And that gets right to the heart of these long-term disputes and understanding why we're having a hard time getting along. And so I went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. And that's kind of what kicked it off for me. It's been a career since then of being focused on this topic.
Well, and thank you so much for sharing your life story. I mean, it sounds like you've had a very, very tough upbringing, and to show your vulnerability as you have today is really, yeah, thank you for doing that, Darryl. That's much appreciated. You've
Yeah.
mentioned you've mentioned a few situations where you've had to obviously build upon your knowledge of trust. So dealing with Indigenous land policy, also dealing with just people day to day on the bus. To what extent do you feel that the principles that you teach can be applied in any situation?
So I've worked in such a broad range of settings. I haven't run across one yet where I felt like, yeah, it's not helpful here. Um, it may not completely resolve the situation, but it does help gain understanding. And you mentioned that I worked with the Canadian military trying to figure out how to help build trust with the locals in Afghanistan. I've worked with nonprofits. I've worked with private sector, public sector, families. I've worked with companies that are global, so training people from all over the world. I taught in Luxembourg, where I had folks from all over Europe. Um, Routinely, the answer is, yeah, this is the way that it works. When people see the model I use and the approach I take, they go, this makes sense. It feels right. It is compelling. Um, it may be that the levers are pulled differently in different cultures, or that different ones have different weight, but it seems like the model holds across all settings. And one of the downsides of writing a doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments is people come and throw you into hostile environments, and so, I found myself trying to help out in places where labor disputes are pretty profound, or where people just aren't getting along. Um, and, I've seen really profound change. Um, one of the stories I find most compelling is one of my students when I was in Luxembourg, because when I teach, or in the master class or in the book, I get people to try to pick a trust partner, and practice the skills, because that's how we get better at it. That's how we learn. And normally I get them to pick someone that's sort of fairly neutral, but one of my students said he wanted to pick his sons, and they were both young. They were 3 and 5, and he felt alienated from them. He'd had to work away for most of their lives, and he said, the relationship's broken. I think I don't think it's ever going to be okay. And he said, I have so little experience with them. I don't know them. I don't know what to do or what to say. I'm scared. I'm frustrated. I lash out at times when I shouldn't. They're afraid of me. And so he went through the course, and we did a bit of coaching, and then he started applying the model to his kids. And at the end of the course, his final report was, things have changed completely. My sons run to me. They throw themselves on me. They tell me they love me. They fight over who gets to sit next to me at dinner. They beg me to read them stories at night. It's a complete transformation. And so I've seen impact like that. And the reason that I've written the book and produced the masterclass is to try to scale that, because I feel like I'm dropping grains of sand in the ocean, Daniel. I need people to come alongside and pick up great big rocks with me. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's such a
Yeah.
fascinating topic, Darryl, because obviously with your experience working in hostile environments, so with foreign government, with your own government, but with foreigners in their lands, like in Afghanistan, you've got different cultures clashing. You've got the Pashtuns, you've got the Tajiks, the Hazaras. I'm really curious to know, how do you actually bring a group of people together that are in conflict, especially with a third party such as the Canadian government, the US government, the Australian government, that are in their country? How do you
Yeah.
actually bring all those groups together to find a common consensus?
Well, it's a real challenge. And partly the Canadian government, when they approached me, said, look, we don't think this is going to work. We believe that we've taken too long. We've been there for several years, and there's no infrastructure, there's no economic development. And in fact, the regime wasn't sustainable, right? In the end, it collapsed to the Taliban. And the challenge that we faced in that setting was, most of the trust literature is focused on individual. So me building trust with you, I show you these different traits that I have. Well, it turns out that one person with a machine gun looks a lot like another person with a machine gun. And what we needed to do was instead focus on the context and understand and include those different parties in the conversation. And if we look at the history of Afghanistan, we see a bunch of people trying to make things better, right? With air quotes.
Mhm.
Um, the warlords started out, and then it was the Russians and then the Taliban, all of them saying, hey, this place is a mess. We're going to make it better for you. They never included the original people in that conversation. They never asked them what better looked like. And when we came in as saviors, the West shows up and we're going to save you. And again, we never looked at the underlying disputes that were going on or
Really?
what
So
good
we
looked
just
like for the
started
people.
jumping to conclusions on our sides, and we didn't actually ask the people on the ground what they wanted? Is that...
That's exactly right.
Wow.
And we didn't come in with an understanding that there are subsets of that population that absolutely hate each other and that they don't have a united sense of what good looks like. And that and we also had, because we've got strong central government, we had this notion that, oh, I've got a job, this is my job description, this is what I'm going to do, you can predict my behavior because this is what I'm supposed to do. They don't have any concept of that in Afghanistan. There is no strong central government. There are no rules that are unbreakable. There are no job descriptions that are,
Yeah.
driving people's behavior. It's all informal elements of social control. So it's things like, who are you related to? What religion are you? What village are you from? Who are your close personal ties? And so we were going in making these commitments, and they were kind of like, yeah. We know you won't be here for long. We just have to survive you. And then, everyone will be jockeying for position again in a few years. Um, But economic development had come to a complete stop. That's why the Canadian military came to me. They said, okay, so trust levels are so low that people aren't willing to learn new skills because there's no guarantee of a future payoff. They're not willing to invest against anything that doesn't pay them immediately right now.
Mhm.
And, part of the context there was, if you're an Afghani male, at least at the time that I was helping, you weren't allowed to own property, get married, have kids, any of those things unless you had a job. And when the Taliban came to you and said, "Hey, here, plant this roadside bomb, $25," that was a job. And so the context was really rigged against them. And they didn't have a clear understanding of it to start with. And so they were trying to create zones of safety in which real economic development would start to actually occur. And so you start by trying to set the context so that people can actually have a chance to be successful, so that the things you want to see happen are actually incentivized to happen. And the deck was stacked for me when I go into a lot of these settings now, and I learned a lot when I was working with the military. But for me, when I go into these settings now, what I try to do is get the parties to tell me what their story is. What's your side of this?
Mhm.
And then get the other party to tell me their story, and then bring them together and say, okay, party one, tell me party two's story. What do you think they think is going on? And it pushes a level of empathy that may not be there to start with. And it causes them to try out this narrative while the other party's sitting there listening, able to say, actually, that's not quite it, or no, that's not how I think. And we start to create a shared narrative because we interpret the world through stories, Daniel. And
Mhm.
if you and I have a profoundly different story, then it's really hard for us to come into alignment and work together because we have a different narrative of what's going on.
Yeah, and it sounds like we also need to, in understanding this context, we actually humanize the situation. So we're not just dealing with necessarily a corporation or just a name on a screen. We're actually dealing with a human being. I can really relate to what you were saying, albeit not such an extreme example as in Afghanistan, but I was brought in once to solve a problem that we had with a client, and there was quite a significant problem, very large miscommunication, talk of a lawsuit. It was really, really on the rocks.
Right.
And like you just said now, the first step was to actually sit down, understand the context. Okay, what is your business doing? What is your business needs? Where is your business going? Now let's do the same for us. And now let's start building a joint consensus and a joint story of our blockers, enablers, and how we're going to both get to this success together and walk to the altar
Yeah.
together. And yeah, like it took some time, but it also took a lot of vulnerability, and it took a lot of humanizing each other and looking at each other as human beings. The fact that we're not machines, we can't expect perfection, but in doing so, we actually managed to turn this relationship around. So that was a very good story. Probably not so much
Yeah.
as what's happened in Afghanistan.
Well, and at the end, it failed. Right. I mean, the Taliban have taken over, and it seems like it's been a disaster from the outside, but we don't know what the story is they're telling within Afghanistan. Some are saying, I'm sure that there's some are saying this is a profound victory, and some are saying this is a complete and utter defeat,
Mhm.
much like every country, right?
Yeah, I mean it's such a complex topic because there's dynamics in there that we just don't experience in the Western world, and it's very hard as an outsider to come in and try and understand that. I can relate. I'm from Russia originally, and Russia's not just one big gigantic country. Well, it is, but it's also made up of dozens and dozens of different republics. You've got different religions. You've got basically republics that have been absorbed through colonialism over the centuries. And a lot of people in the West don't see the true dynamics of what's playing out right now. But yeah,
Right.
it's pretty hectic. It's pretty hectic. And I think we'll see, if you remember what happened in Chechnya in the 90s, that's going to become, in my opinion, something that may play out over time as the situation worsens in that part of the world. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, and again, competing narratives. right? Profoundly different stories, I suspect, within Russia and all around the world about, what's being done, why it's being done, who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. Um, I don't think any of us wakes up in the morning and says, "Okay, I'm an evil jerk. Today
Mm.
I'm going to rule the world." That's cartoon stuff, right?
One man's freedom fighter is another
So,
man's terrorist, as they say.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's about understanding our narratives and coming together.
Mhm. So, other than understanding these narratives and understanding the context, and maybe showing a bit of vulnerability and being human, what other elements do you feel are important in order to build trust in the world?
So I believe there are 10 levers that we can pull to build trust. And I think, those who aren't very good at building trust have a lever that they pull. Usually it's the ability lever, right? I have this much experience, this kind of background, these kind of competencies. And those who are, a little better at building trust have multiple levers that they pull. Those who are really good at building trust have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. And so for me, I told you about the formula at the start, the uncertainty times vulnerability equals risk. Well, that means that early in relationships, uncertainty is really high, which means the tolerance for vulnerability is really small. And as that relationship deepens, the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And in really deep relationships, we see really small levels of uncertainty, huge range of vulnerability that we could tolerate. And so building trust becomes a matter of where does uncertainty come from and how do we take steps to reduce it? Where does vulnerability come from? How do we take steps to help people manage those perceptions or manage their levels of vulnerability? And once we've made the trust decision, we have perceived outcomes. And there's a couple levers in there as well. Was the outcome a success or a failure? And then who gets the credit? Who gets the blame? And so we can actually have a conversation about what a good outcome looks like before we get there. So we've got a shared understanding of it rather than us evaluating it afterwards to say, well, that was good or that was bad. And then in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike somebody else. And, you know, we interpret the world through stories. So if we like people, we have a positive story about them. We tend to evaluate them more positively. We're more likely to trust them. And it has an impact on our perceptions of the outcomes. We'll have a different set of criteria for what an outcome looked like. Was it good or bad based on whether we liked or disliked the other person? And so for me, it comes down to how do we come to understand those multiple levers and how do we start to pull them effectively? So I'll start with the uncertainty piece. There's 4 levers there. 3 of them are based on us as individuals, which is where most of the research sits. And the levers that are most commonly given are benevolence, integrity, and ability. And benevolence is the belief you've got my best interest at heart, that you'll act in my best interest, even if it's not in your own short-term best interest. And so, we could reframe that as care and concern for others or
Mhm.
affection or whatever we wanted to call it. But somehow we have people's best interest. Integrity is, do I follow through on my promises and do my actions line up with the values that I express? And then the last one is competence, the ability to actually do what I say I'm going to do. And even in that, lever, which is one of our favorites, we'll miss, right? Because we'll come in with our own perceptions of what excellence looks like and not include the other party. And a lot of times we profoundly uh, under identify what excellence looks like. And so I'll ask a room full of executives, who here's a great leader, and all the hands will go up, and I'll say, well, what does
Of
that
course.
mean? Right? Yeah, because no one's going to sit there and go, well, not me, buddy.
Well, unless they
But
want to show extreme vulnerability, in which case that's a plus, right?
yeah, but I'll start saying to them, so are there people you've met who are great leaders? What did they do? And we start to build a definition. When I teach a class, I'll say to people, what's a great professor look like? Because who better to ask than the students? And then I'll say, well, here's what other professors would probably say, and here's what my bosses would say. And you'll see that these lists are slightly different. But I need to include all of my stakeholders to actually have a clear sense of what excellence looks like. And when you and I were having our initial conversation, I said, what does a good guest look like? What would a good guest be? And we started talking about not only your perspective, but also your audience's perspective about what good looks like. And so for us to effectively pull that lever, we actually need to include other people in the conversation and then start
Actually
saying, this is what you
communicate.
said good look like. Yeah, go figure, right?
Fancy that.
So, and then, if we're trying to pull the integrity lever, one of the places we fall down is I make a promise to you and you've heard something different than I intended. And so we've got a miscommunication. And I think I finished, and you're sitting there going, well, when are you going to do the thing you promised you were going to do? And so if I'm not clear with you about what the promise is, and if I don't say to you, do you remember when I told you I was going to do this? This is me doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gives you the opportunity to go, wait a minute, that's not what I heard. Oh, well, let's talk through again. And here's, maybe we need to compromise, or maybe we need to have a discussion about this. Similarly, if an organization makes a decision and their stakeholders are sitting there looking at them going, how does that line up with the values you've told me you have? If we don't take care and concern to help develop the story, then we leave it vulnerable for everyone to interpret in their own way. And so we actually need to be active about saying, this is how this decision lines up with the values that we express. These are our core values. This is what this decision does. And here's how we think it lines up. Otherwise, there's room for cynicism and miscommunication.
Definitely.
And then when it comes to benevolence, it's, actually asking the other person what their best interests are. What does success look like for you? How do I help you get there?
And not trying to define it for them. So actually asking them to define it for themselves, communicate it clearly so that you don't get yourself offside, like in Afghanistan.
Yeah, right? Where all these people come in saying, we're going to do what's best for you, but we're not going to include you in the conversation. You'll know it when you see it.
And trust us, we know what we're doing. We've done this before.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yes, we've overthrown lots of governments and come in and created more chaos than actually needed to be and become, entrenched. Yeah. So, one of the things I do in my courses and in my book and with all my clients is I'll give them templates, for conversation. So, and I've, we've got this trust canvas that we use with our in-depth courses where people get a list of questions around these different levers that enable them to kind of go through and say, have I asked these questions? Do I have a sense of, do they think I'm benevolent? Do they think I have integrity? Do they think I have ability? Do they understand my context? Do they understand the rules of the game that constrain my behavior? Because we trust people all the time. It's just a matter of how much do we trust them. And, it's part of the social lubricant that allows societies to function. And a big part of that is the context that we are embedded in. I used to ask students, I'd say, if you could be anywhere, doing anything with anyone, how many of you would be here listening to me speak? Now, I stopped doing that, Daniel, because it wasn't good for my self-esteem. But, because we can all think of other places we'd rather be.
Well, to be honest, Darryl, I'm actually really, really, really happy to be here with you right now, listening to this and recording it. No, I genuinely am. So learning a lot. So right now, it's here.
Nice. Well, thank you. So, but the question then becomes why, right? Why are you here if it doesn't float your boat? Or why are you here? Like, what is it that drives your interest? And usually it's the context, right? It's my job, or I'm trying to solve another problem that's really important to me, or, this is a topic that's has deep roots for me and it feels like a place where I can be successful. So these are all parts of the context. And as we start to come to understand our own context and are able to communicate it more effectively to others, we actually start to reduce their uncertainty. Makes it easier to predict how we're going to behave. One of the examples I use for context is we go into a doctor's office. The doctor comes in, white coat, stethoscope, pulling on some latex gloves, and says, take off your clothes. And we do, right?
Because you're in
I've
a
tried that
doctor's
in other
office.
places, Daniel. It doesn't work. Right. like let's just move that to the same two people, same conversation, but we move it from the doctor's office to a gas station restroom. It goes from credible to creepy in a heartbeat,
Oh yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
It's like a scene
Probably
from a horror
criminal as
movie all of
well,
a sudden.
almost, depending on the
Yeah,
level of
yeah,
consent.
yes. So context has a huge impact on us, particularly early on. You know, we trust people. We go to restaurants, we get in cabs, we get on airplanes, we have conversations with people. We trust people all the time without knowing them at a really deep level. And so the weight of context is actually primary early on in the relationship. And then it slides to a lower level, and those personal constraints, those personal elements start to become more powerful. And so those are four of the levers that we can pull to build stronger relationships with others. And I got to tell
Fantastic.
you, one of my pet peeves is, there's a lot of people talking about trust, but and how important it is, and how little we have of it, but there's not a lot of people talking about how to build it, Daniel. And I think we can actually be intentional about building it.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. It's fascinating stuff, Darryl. There's obviously a lot to unpack there. Maybe can I just burrow a little bit deeper on this one of the concepts you touched on around context. So in a
Sure.
lot of situations, I think we've all had our regrets. We've all done things that we may have regretted. We may have handled interactions better in our life. Maybe not delivered on something that we've promised. Do you feel that
Right.
at the most basic fundamental level that people that are disingenuous or let's call them liars, can they be trusted? Can a leopard really change their spots?
I think there's room for human growth for all of us. And this is in some ways related to another question I get asked sometimes, which is, can we actually ever repair trust? Um, the answer is yes. We can get better. Um, and partly it's about, we're seeing a lot of leaders right now that are frankly disappointing. Um, our expectation of leaders in the political sphere, anyways, is that they will have our best interest at heart, that they will represent us. And the context seems to be driving a set of people that we don't really want to be there. We're seeing vilification of one another. We're seeing, politicians have done a remarkably effective job at convincing us that they're all incompetent and evil. Because each side tells us that the other side is evil and incompetent, and you know what? Eventually, we just believe them. They could stop digging at any point now, and so people who step into that role are putting their family at risk for all kinds of things. They're making choices about vulnerability, not only for themselves but for others. And it seems like we're attracting more and more people who don't really care about anybody but themselves. And so if we were to shift that context, we would hopefully see different sets of behaviors and different responses. Um, if there's a cost for lying, and it is painful enough, it'll start to change behavior patterns for folks who are more susceptible to the context than others. Um, there is a struggle there. You've raised a really good question, a very complex question, because there's elements of integrity that come into there. There's elements of ability that come into there, elements of benevolence that come into there. When people are lying to others, what's the intent? Whose best interest is being served? And what's the narrative that they have, and what's the narrative they'd like us to take away? So I think that there's the possibility to reform those people and to have them learn, but there would actually have to be consequences.
So actual accountability needs to be in place in order for the model to work.
Well, I think that's a really good question. Yes, I need to be held to my to my account. I need to be held to account for my actions and my behaviors. What I really try to do is help people close the gap between how much they should be trusted and how much they actually are. And in the case of people who are full of crap, I'd prefer we don't trust them. You know, and there are places where people shouldn't trust me. You know, I'm legally blind. You shouldn't let me borrow your car or paint your house, right? There are places where I will disappoint you. And if I articulate that early and say, look, here's how I'm constrained, here's what my abilities are, then I give you the ability to take that into account. You know, you may be able to say, okay, there's certain things that Darryl can do and certain things he can't do. And there's certain things he could do with the right supports in place.
Mm-hmm.
And
So it's about
so,
setting those expectations up front and then aligning the delivery to those expectations rather than trying to go delivery first and then talking about expectations later once everyone's disappointed.
right. Yes. And so this is why we have the conversations early about what does good look like? What's a good outcome look like? What does good behavior on my part look like? You know, what are your best interests? How do I help meet those? And what are the commitments that I'm making? You know, and one of the challenges we face a lot of times is we like to overpromise. And, you know, what we see particularly in the US, is this massive overpromising, particularly in marketing campaigns, right? It's the best ever. And you have it and you're kind of like, well, that wasn't really the best ever. I mean, it was okay.
Or it was
And
even
so
good,
you're
but
left
it's
with a
not the best
disappointment.
ever.
Right. Yeah. And so having a clear sense of what promises I'm prepared to make, you know, my promises are more around process than outcome. So for your podcast, I promise I'd be here. I'm here. And I will do my best to answer any question you have. You're asking some great questions. There's a level of complexity to them that causes me to have to think and try to articulate in a way that's true to the model, but still simple enough that folks are able to, you know, absorb and go, is he waffling? Is he trying not to answer the question? No, like I'm really trying to answer the question as honestly as possible without getting too complicated. Because nobody who's listening has spent 20 years doing what I've been doing.
Yeah, I was going to say that you're trying to compress like 20 years worth of knowledge, your time at McKinsey, your time, speaking all over the world and as faculty, you're trying to compress this into less than 1 hour podcast. You're doing pretty well, by the way, Daryl.
Oh, thanks, Daniel.
Excellent. So, Daryl, if we look at the business world, and obviously you've done quite a bit of work both within academia and outside of academia studying this. What do you think could be the top 5 ways in which CEOs can build trust in companies, just at a macro level, based on what you've seen all over the world?
Yeah. Okay. So, for me, I'd go back to the levers. I think one of the struggles we have in organizations right now is people are focused on ability, but ability is a moving target. And I would have ongoing conversations about what good looks like for the organization, for its aspirations. I would acknowledge that that's going to be a moving target. And when it comes to integrity, I would acknowledge that it's going to be hard for us to promise long-term results, but we can promise effort and we can promise process, and that we'll have intent, right? And so, for me, benevolence is probably the strongest lever right now. That we're going to try to have the best interest of those that we serve and all of our other stakeholders in mind when we make decisions. Um, so we'll be thinking about the best interest of the employees that work here. We'll be thinking about the best interest of our clients, and part of that is served by the employees being engaged and interested and experienced and competent and capable. Um, and then I would start having conversations around context and what are the rules that we have in place right now, and how do they push for the behaviors that we actually want to see? Because so often they're misaligned. And I spoke with an organization. Um, they were rewarding people based on behavior, on performance, right? And a lot of the top performers were starting to acknowledge that, hey, I didn't do this by myself. Like, if some of these other people didn't help me, I wouldn't have performed at this level. There are people who have sacrificed for me to do well. And this is starting to feel a bit unfair. Now, I know that this is not normal in a lot of organizations where top performers just say, yeah, look at me, I'm great. But we started looking at this notion of givers and takers that Adam Grant had put forward, and the notion that there are some people within organizations who give and facilitate performance for everyone else, and there are some who take and act as a bit of a cancer within organizations. And what the organization had failed to do is figure out how to evaluate those givers and compensate them and reward them and acknowledge them appropriately. And so we actually started to change some of the structures. And we said, everyone's going to get to nominate someone for a giver, being a giver. And every quarter within each subgroup, we're going to have a giver award. And so we're going to start to see more of that behavior. We're going to start seeing recognition of that behavior. We're going to start to see it show up more often because people realize it's being acknowledged and rewarded. And so that's part of it is sitting down and actually having an honest conversation about what are the incentive structures that we have and how do they align with the actions we actually want to see. So those would be for me, the main pieces. And a big part of this is having a shared vocabulary. I've worked with some large companies. I've done some work with SAP, a huge software company. They're global. They're all over the place. Their their global VP for HR advisors is a woman named Kelsey Trigg, and she's probably the best leader I've ever seen. She has a truly global team within a high-tech organization, cross-culture, virtual, like a lot of these different things that would make it hard to build rapport and strong connections and good teams. And they measure her trust ratings; they're off the charts constantly, and so is the rest of her team. And she attributes a lot of that to having shared vocabulary. I took their team through the trust training, taught them how to talk about some of these different elements, these different levers, and how to pull them. And they're having incredible success because they've got a shared vocabulary, a way to talk about some of these topics.
And when you say success, do you mean profitability or engagement or basically cohesiveness or all of the above? Are they all linked?
It's a big part of all of those things form a big element, but what drives what they get evaluated against are their trust levels and their client scores. And their clients are 8,000 leaders within SAP. And those scores have been off the charts. And so that's how they get measured. That's how they get evaluated. It hasn't, they haven't rolled out the training to the rest of the organization at this point. I love it if they did. But when we start to see these, we know that higher trust levels lead to higher returns to shareholders, higher employee engagement, higher innovation, adaptation.
It's a win-win.
It wins all over the place. People are happier and organizations make more money. And I've actually been approached by a venture capital fund that's talking about making trust the primary decision point for them about whether they invest in an organization or not. Does that organization do a good job of building trust from the leadership team down? And, for them, it just makes sense. This is how we're going to get our investment back. This is how we're going to generate more revenue. And a big part of it is same vocabulary, being able to talk, because we're able to actually talk about things and build trust in a way that's systematic and intentional, not fuzzy. And, there's no blindfolds involved. There's no walking on hot coals. There's no falling off of things.
Yeah.
It's How do people make that decision? How do we have these conversations? How do we push it forward in a way that's intentional?
I mean, it seems simple, but it's not easy, right? So
Right.
if you have, for example, if you consider a rowboat, this is the analogy I'm trying to get right in my head so that I understand this. And if you have 4 rowers in that rowboat, and you have each of them rowing in a slightly different direction, that boat is not going to go very far, or it's not going to be very easy to get to the finish line. But if you
Right.
align those 4 rowers to a common objective, that's your common language,
Yep.
and you actually apply the levers as you've mentioned, and you start rowing together in one direction, then you're
Yeah.
going to hit that finish line real quick.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And a lot of times when I get people to start practicing these skills, so let's use benevolence as the example. I'll give people a template for a conversation. And first, I'll have them have a trust conversation where they say to somebody, look, I'm taking this course on trust, or I heard this guy speak, and he said trust is really important. It's a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. And it had me thinking about, how are we vulnerable to each other? If we're coworkers or neighbors or colleagues, then my results depend on you to a certain extent. And we've got this interdependence going on. And so there's a connection between us. And then it occurs to me, how much do I know about you, or how much do you know about me? There's an opportunity for us to actually build a stronger relationship here. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to practice some of these things with me. So that's the initial trust conversation. And what I hear from folks is, okay, so it felt a bit awkward, it felt a bit uncomfortable, but it really got a positive response. And then they step into the benevolence conversation, which is, Darryl talks about benevolence, this care for somebody else. And he says it's having someone's best interest at heart. I think I do that, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And everyone goes, oh God, yes. And, maybe they've got a story in mind. And it brings to home this fact that it doesn't matter if I think I'm benevolent. Daniel, you have to think I'm benevolent for it to have impact. And then we take the next step and we sort of narrow the funnel a bit and we say, have you ever had somebody really have your back? Like, really felt like someone was on your side. Well, what did they do? What did that look like? How did it feel? And now we start to pull from them the story about when someone looked out for them and what that felt like and what they were doing. And we're starting to get hints about what benevolence looks like for them. And then we narrow the funnel further and we say, what does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? What would it look like if I was benevolent to you? And now we've got an opportunity to be transparent. Because as the future unfolds and we're able to say, oh, do you remember when you told me this is what benevolence would look like? This is me trying to do that. So we reduce the probability that it's going to be misinterpreted or misunderstood. And we start having this positive narrative through which the people view the world when it comes to us.
Wow, love it, absolutely love it.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about building the positives here, and how to build a positive relationship, one where there's trust and you understand each other's objectives, and you give a little to get a little as well. If we flip it the other way and look at how to actually prevent issues, one of the key things that I took away from your masterclass is, if you have a high amount of trust, it actually acts as a warning system, so that you find out about issues before they occur, before they blow up, before they become something grander than what they are. That was really, really important, and hit home so hard for me, because if we can prevent the issue, then we don't need to cure it. Prevention's always better
Right.
than cure.
And this is one of the challenges that leaders run into often. Like, why am I the last to know? Why are people not coming to me with the bad news when things are going wrong? Or, giving me a heads up about it before it hits the chipper. And a lot of that's a trust related issue, right? They don't want to be the one to tell you. They feel vulnerable by being don't kill the messenger.
And as
Um,
a leader, I think you should also ask yourself, am I creating the right sort of environment for people to open up? What am I giving in terms of my vulnerability? What am I sharing? You know, for
yeah.
example, as a leader, you may not always be close to the detail. Like I work in tech as an example, so I don't understand code. I don't understand analysis, but I understand how things fit together so that we can get a common outcome. But if I go
Right.
in up front and say, look, I'm not going to question you on your code. I don't understand that level of detail. I'm trusting you to do that. This is not my strong suit. That's showing vulnerability. And hopefully that
Right.
can put someone at ease a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're the expert on this. What do I need to do to help you solve the problem that you're struggling with? What do you need from me? What are the resources you need? Who do you need me to talk to? Who's giving you a hard time or not? How do I clear the path for you?
So you're basically letting that person set their needs, which is coming back to the point we made earlier in this podcast. You're letting them define what success is for them rather than you trying to impose it.
Absolutely. And, when I ask people, who do you trust? I get these sort of close, tight personal relationships. That's where our head goes. But when I flip the question and say, who trusts you? I get this really long pause. And people say, well, how would I know? How do I know if somebody trusts me or not? Well, let's go back to the definition. Trust is a willingness to be vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone's going to behave. Well, how are people vulnerable to their leaders? They give them real honest feedback. They push back against ideas they don't think are going to work. They try new things and are willing to make mistakes. They, are honest and open about struggles that they're having. All of these are, they deliver the bad news. These are all ways that they can make themselves vulnerable to you. And if they are, then they trust you. If they aren't, then they don't.
Wow. 8:25 here in the morning, and my brain is just like so fired up from this conversation. There's so much I want to like unpack further, but we're almost out of time. Darryl, signature question.
Yeah,
If you could go back to your 20-year-old self, what is the one key piece of advice that you would give?
it's going to be okay. I think I would tell myself, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, but it's going to be all right, and treat those mistakes as learning opportunities, because that's what they are. Yeah, I think that would be the key piece of advice I'd have for myself, and it'd be the piece of advice I'd have for a lot of teenagers and young 20-year-olds now who are struggling with mental health challenges and struggling with the world. And they are, because of the setting that we're in. Uncertainty is so high. Everyone's struggling. And they're in a time of transition as well, so it's really hard. And it's going to be okay.
Fantastic piece of advice. And also, I'd probably add to that, we live in a world where, I've heard this term before, a prison of perfection, where the things that you see on social media all seem perfect. Like everyone's smashing it, everyone's doing well, everyone's got Lamborghinis or this or that, whatever your measure of success is. And that
Right.
is just such a small subset of what's actually happening. And it's
Right.
completely unrealistic.
And
So you
no
need to exit
guarantee,
that
even with
prison.
all those things. Yeah, even with all those things, no guarantee that they're any happier than you are. Right?
Yeah.
Because they're still stuck in this driving, and it's never enough.
It will never be enough, because there'll always be someone richer than you, someone with, more followers than you, someone with a better car than you. You will never be enough if you try and use those measures. So I think,
I had a great line from my son who said, "Dad, I've come to realize that happiness is not something I pursue, but something I realize I have."
how old is your son?
21.
Very wise. Very wise for a statement from a
Yeah,
21-year-old.
seriously, right? So,
Awesome.
yeah. So how have you've taken my masterclass? What did you think?
Oh, look, it was definitely a real eye opener for me. There were elements that I was already aware of, such as context, such as even just the fact that the scarcity of trust makes it more valuable. That was a really interesting insight to me. But
Right.
these levers that you talk about, that was really, really actionable, tangible pieces of advice that I think we can all take away, irrespective of the situation, whether you're in corporate, whether you've got your own business, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're in government. Part of the reason why it's important to do this is to actually sit down and devote attention to it. This is not stuff that you're taught in school necessarily. For a lot of people, it's not
Right.
even things that your parents would teach you. I think if you approach it from the perspective of actually wanting to learn how to become a better leader in your chosen field, and you have that intent, that's probably half of the effort. And then the other half is actually applying it and defining those levers for you, because they're going to mean different things to different people. Obviously the principles can be the same, but it's very different, I'm sure, to your time in McKinsey, advising corporates versus, undertaking your doctoral thesis.
Yeah, or families that I work with or whoever. You're right. Yeah, I think, Daniel, trust is the lowest we've ever seen. We need to be more intentional now than we've ever been. And that's the goal of the book and the masterclass and the other courses I teach, is to help people be more aware and more intentional.
Awesome. Well, Darryl, I think we're pretty close to calling it a wrap today. I know that you have also organized something special for our listeners. So if anyone is interested in undertaking Darryl's masterclass, you can simply go to his website, trustunlimited.com, and there's a 10% discount code that can be applied for the masterclass. Right. So that's just apply the discount code of dancing_with_doubt, and you'll get 10% off. Have I read that out correctly, Darryl?
You've done it perfectly, and I'm hoping that your listeners are able to take advantage of that, and would love to hear feedback about how it's been for them as well.
Definitely, and please, listeners, take it as someone that has literally just completed the course last night. It is worth every penny in gold. I think you'll get a lot out of it, and it can help you build some of those relationships and undertake some of those actual trust steps that we talked about today to improve your life and your situation. Darryl, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I've certainly learned a lot. Yeah, we've gone really, really deep on all things trust. Normally I'll cover maybe 3 or 4 different main topics, but here we've just gone super deep on trust and absolutely loved it. So thanks again for your time.
Great experience. I really enjoyed it. Anytime.
Well, there you have it, dear listeners. That's a wrap for episode 6. If you've got value from this episode, would really, really appreciate your support. Spread the knowledge, spread the love, give us a like, a comment, some feedback, subscribe, all that good stuff. Tell your friends, tell your family. It'll make a big difference to me, and I would really appreciate it. And hopefully it would help spread this knowledge far and wide. You can find more episodes at dancingwithdoubt.com. And as usual, I'll have my monthly blog up and running where I reflect on some of the key themes and takeouts from episodes such as today. And you can be sure there'll be plenty of them after this one. Thanks for lending me your ears wherever in the world you are. Till next time, may success be with you.